November 7, 1942. The Pacific sky was a sheet of molten silver, burning with the sound of engines. A formation of Japanese bombers roared toward a small American outpost on the island of Espiritu Santo. Below, the ground seemed to wait for death, men diving for cover, sirens wailing, dust trembling. Then came the whistle. One bomb, then another. The surface erupted into smoke and flame, but somewhere beneath that chaos, deep in a carved-out belly of the mountain, a group of engineers sat listening to the earth roar, and felt nothing collapse. Inside that tunnel, mugs of coffee barely rippled. A lamp swung once and steadied. It was the first quiet proof that American engineering could defy not just the enemy but gravity itself. Major Thomas F. Farrell wiped a film of dust off his glasses and gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "They hit us dead on," he murmured, running a hand along the damp concrete wall. And the wall didn't even crack. Around him, a handful of engineers, men with slide rules tucked in their breast pockets and grease on their hands, looked at each other in silent pride. Outside, chaos still raged. Inside, they had built something that refused to fall. That moment would mark the beginning of a silent revolution beneath the war. Farrell had been a civil engineer before the Army came calling. He built dams in New York, tunnels under rivers, and had a love for precision that bordered on obsession. When the U.S. entered the war, the Corps of Engineers recruited him to design underground facilities in the Pacific, places where men, fuel, and ammunition could survive the kind of aerial assaults that turned cities into ash. The request had seemed absurd at first. "You want me to build tunnels that survive bombs?" he'd asked. The colonel had only smiled. "We're not asking you to stop bombs, Major. Just to make them irrelevant." By late 1942, the Pacific had turned into an open graveyard of metal. Every island was a target, every supply line a gamble. The Japanese dominated the air, and American troops quickly learned that tents and trenches were useless under the sky's fire. Commanders begged for solutions. "We can't keep fighting from craters," one report read. "We need to disappear." The order reached Washington, and Somervell, General Brehon Somervell, the iron-willed chief of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, gave his directive: "If the sky belongs to them, the ground belongs to us." That was how the underground war began. Farrell and his team of 50 engineers were shipped from one island to another, armed not with rifles but with blueprints, dynamite, and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. They arrived on Espiritu Santo to find a mountain of volcanic rock and a schedule that would break anyone sane. The orders were simple: carve out storage chambers for fuel, machine shops, and a hospital, all bomb-proof. "You've got 6 months," Somervell had said. "Make the mountain swallow us whole." Every swing of a pickaxe in that heat felt like a small rebellion against nature. The men worked in 12-hour shifts, soaked in sweat, the air thick with dust. Rainwater leaked from cracks above, mixing with diesel fumes and human breath. They learned quickly that building underground was not about brute force but patience. Farrell used to say, "You don't dig through a mountain, you persuade it." He studied the grain of the rock, the way it fractured under stress. When he saw hairline cracks forming in the ceiling, he didn't curse. He adjusted his angles, shifted the drilling pattern. "The mountain talks," he'd tell his men. "You just have to listen." There was humor even in misery. When a young engineer named Corporal Redden once miscalculated a blast radius and sent a cloud of smoke billowing through the camp kitchen, Farrell simply walked out of the haze and said, "Well, at least dinner's seasoned." But under the laughter was exhaustion. Food was scarce and so was sleep. They were building faster than plans could be drawn. Some nights, Farrell would sit outside the tunnel mouth, watching bombers trace faint silver lines across the distant sky, wondering if their mountain could really hold when its turn came. The answer came on that November morning. The air raid began before sunrise. The engineers scrambled inside, sealing the blast doors, listening as the world above shook. When the bombing stopped, Farrell was the first to step out. The camp was gone, vehicles twisted, ground shredded, but the tunnel stood unscathed. "You built us a sanctuary," Redden whispered. Farrell didn't reply. He just looked at the smoking horizon and realized the war had changed. Word spread fast. Reports traveled up the chain, and within weeks new orders arrived. Replicate the Espiritu Santo design across the Pacific. But as the workload grew, so did the skepticism. Commanders doubted they could replicate such precision elsewhere. Supplies were short, and the terrain differed from island to island. Farrell's new team included miners, surveyors, even a few former oilmen. None were soldiers in the traditional sense, yet all knew that a single miscalculation could bury them alive. The conflict shifted from external bombs to internal pressure. Farrell clashed with officers who wanted speed over safety. "You can't rush rock," he said more than once, earning himself more enemies than friends. He also began corresponding with a younger engineer back home, Lieutenant Edward Harper, who was experimenting with reinforced concrete mixes in California. Harper's formula, cement blended with volcanic ash, was rumored to make walls nearly impervious to cracks. Farrell requested samples, calling it the miracle mud. When they finally arrived, the men tested it under simulated blast. The results stunned them. The walls flexed instead of fracturing, absorbing the shock like a living thing. It was Harper's invention that would quietly alter the war's infrastructure. Using volcanic ash from the islands themselves, they could build faster and stronger. Farrell called it, turning the enemy's dirt against him. The irony amused the men, though none failed to grasp the gravity of their work. One misstep could mean burial under tons of stone. Yet morale held steady, held together by Farrell's dry humor and his insistence that engineers fight with foresight, not fire. As the months passed, the tunnels expanded, wide enough for trucks, strong enough to store munitions, cool enough for field hospitals. Soldiers stationed there joked it was the only place in the Pacific where you could sleep through a bombing. But Farrell knew it was more than that. He saw a philosophy taking shape. War wasn't just about weapons anymore, it was about endurance. The side that could survive the longest beneath destruction would win. One evening, as they lit the generator lamps and the tunnel walls glowed amber, Farrell ran his hand over the concrete surface. It felt warm, alive, humming faintly with the memory of impact. He looked at Redden and said quietly, "We've stopped building shelters. We're building proof." The younger man frowned. "Proof of what?" Farrell smiled, weary but proud. "That human will is stronger than gravity." Outside, thunder rolled again, not from the sky but from another bombing miles away. The earth trembled faintly, like an old drumbeat. The engineers listened, then went back to work. They knew the enemy would keep coming. They also knew that every inch they carved brought them closer to something unbreakable. Farrell took one last look at the tunnel entrance before disappearing inside. Smoke drifted over the hills, and the horizon pulsed red. He didn't know yet that his design would soon be copied across the Pacific, or that decades later, those same tunnels would still stand, silent, dry, untouched by time. All he knew was that tonight, his men could sleep. The mountain for now was on their side. Rain came first, soft at dawn, then hard enough to drown the sound of men shouting orders. Inside the tunnel, puddles gathered where the lamps glowed weakest, and the scent of wet concrete mixed with sweat and kerosene. Major Thomas F. Farrell stood ankle-deep in water, staring at the steady drip from the ceiling. "It's not the bombs that'll bury us," he said grimly, "it's the rain." The engineers around him, mud-caked, sleepless, and too proud to admit defeat, looked up as another droplet struck the floor like a ticking clock. The Pacific wasn't just an enemy above ground. Beneath it, it was a siege of water, pressure, and time. By early 1943, Farrell's mountain fortress had proven itself against bombs, but nature had other plans. Monsoon season came without mercy. Torrents swept down from the ridges, filling the entrance trenches and seeping through microfractures no blueprint could predict. The ground groaned like a living thing. Each new tunnel they dug became a war between engineering and the unpredictable heart of the earth. Farrell's men began to joke that they were fighting Poseidon now. But the humor didn't hide the truth. If they couldn't tame the floods, the whole structure would eventually collapse from within. Corporal Redden, once the youngest and most carefree of the team, now walked with the solemnity of a man twice his age. His boots never dried and his fingertips were perpetually cracked from the constant damp. He had grown quieter since the last cave-in, when a lateral passageway they were reinforcing gave way during a storm. 2 men died before dawn. Redden had helped dig them out, bare hands clawing through mud, his face streaked with grit and rain. "The mountain always takes a toll," he said one night as he stared at the tunnel wall, tracing a line of moisture that ran like a vein. Farrell didn't reply. He didn't need to. Both men understood that every triumph underground demanded a sacrifice. The army wanted progress reports, maps, assurances. Washington didn't care about humidity levels or tectonic instability, they cared about deadlines. Farrell began keeping his own records, hand-drawn diagrams noting where condensation formed, where water trickled in and how the walls responded. He became a man possessed by patterns. "Every drop tells a story," he muttered once to Harper, who had finally arrived from the States with his miracle concrete mixture. Harper was a wiry, pale man, brilliant but awkward, and used to the jungle heat. The others called him Professor, half mocking, half reverent. He didn't seem to notice. He only cared about the material, the volcanic ash composite that might save them from both nature and war. One evening, with the storm raging outside, Farrell and Harper stood by a newly cured section of wall. Harper tapped it lightly with a wrench. "Listen," he said, and the sound that came back wasn't hollow, it was a soft, dense thud like striking packed clay. "It flexes," Harper explained. "Absorbs vibration instead of resisting it. Same principle as bamboo, strength through yield." Farrell grinned despite himself. "You're telling me to make the mountain bend?" Harper shrugged. "Better that than break." The test came sooner than either expected. A quake rolled through the island 3 nights later, a deep, bone-vibrating tremor that made lanterns sway and tools clatter off shelves. Men froze mid-breath as the walls trembled, dust sifting from the ceiling. Farrell barked orders to shut down the generators, and for 10 seconds the world held its breath. Then slowly the rumbling eased. No collapse. No cracks. When the lights flickered back to life, the men found the new section still intact, unblemished. Harper exhaled shakily. "I think it worked," he whispered. Farrell clapped him on the shoulder. "Professor, you may have just taught us how to outsmart God." The success gave the crew hope, but it also raised expectations. Command decided to replicate their designs in other Pacific installations. Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Guam. Farrell's name began circulating through engineering reports as a problem solver, though he never saw himself as one. He still lay awake most nights, haunted by the sound of dripping water, the memory of lost men, and the endless weight of responsibility pressing from above. "It's not just rock and concrete," he told Redden one night. "It's trust. Every life down here depends on the math being right." The men admired him for his calm, though they sensed the cost. He had begun writing letters home to no one in particular, addressed only to whoever finds this. In them, he described the strange intimacy of building something that must never be seen. "We live in darkness," one entry read, "but we build for light." Those letters were never sent. He stored them in a tin box at the back of the command chamber, beneath the blueprints. Outside, the landscape transformed daily, mudslides, fallen trees, rivers shifting course. One morning, a supply convoy failed to arrive, and the men rationed food for a week. Harper, ever the scientist, improvised an experiment to collect condensation from tunnel ceilings as drinking water. When it worked, they called it rain whiskey. The nickname stuck. Even Farrell laughed that time. "We might not win medals," he said, "but we'll never die of thirst." Small victories mattered. As the storm season deepened, new challenges emerged. The tunnel's drainage system, originally designed for runoff, began clogging under debris. The men took turns crawling through waist-high culverts to clear blockages. Redden volunteered often. Once, he nearly drowned when a sudden rush of rainwater surged through the pipe. Farrell dragged him out himself, coughing and sputtering. Afterward, Redden looked at him with eyes wide and wild. "Why do you keep building, sir?" he gasped. Farrell hesitated, then said softly, "Because if we stop, the mountain wins." In late February, Harper proposed adding an inner shell of reinforced segments, an idea so radical it drew laughter at first. "You want 2 tunnels inside one?" someone scoffed. "Exactly," Harper said. "A hollow spine. The outer layer takes the force, the inner survives." Farrell approved it immediately. It took weeks to install, but when they finished, the structure had a strange, elegant symmetry, like the ribcage of a giant fossil. The men called it the heartbeat. Then came the flood. On March 3rd, the heavens opened as if the ocean itself had turned upside down. Water gushed into the entrances faster than pumps could drain it. Farrell's team sealed doors, diverted channels, fought to keep the generators dry. For 30 hours straight they battled the storm. At one point, when the pressure against the blast door threatened to buckle it, Farrell ordered everyone back. "If it breaks, we lose the section," Harper warned. Farrell shook his head. "If it breaks, we lose the war." He grabbed a wrench and joined the effort, tightening bolts until his hands bled. The door held. When the rain finally stopped, the tunnel stood dry behind it, muddy but unbroken. The men slept for the first time in 2 days, sprawled across the floor, their tools beside them like loyal dogs. Farrell stayed awake, listening to the faint hum of wind beyond the entrance. He knew now that bombs weren't the true enemy, entropy was. The world above could destroy itself 100 times, but if his tunnels endured, some part of order would remain. In the dim light, Harper sat beside him, sketching reinforcement ideas on a scrap of map. "You ever wonder what happens to all this when the war's over?" he asked. Farrell smiled faintly. "If the world's lucky, no one will ever need to know." Harper nodded. "And if it's not?" Farrell looked toward the tunnel mouth, where the air shimmered faintly with dawn. "Then maybe what we're building here won't just survive the war. Maybe it'll survive us." Outside, the rain had stopped. The island steamed in the morning heat, rivers carving new paths down the slopes. Inside, the tunnels glistened quietly, alive with light and purpose. For the first time, Farrell felt something like peace. The mountain had tried to drown them and failed. But in the silence that followed, he also sensed a truth forming beneath the victory. Nature wasn't done yet. The ground itself was still shifting, still waiting for the next test. And when it came, he'd be ready to listen again. By the summer of 1944, the engineers no longer flinched when the ground shook. They had built through rain, flood, and quake, and now they faced the most violent force of all, man's attempt to outdo his own destruction. The bombs had changed. What once fell in hundreds of pounds now came in thousands. High-velocity, armor-piercing, delayed detonation weapons, designed to burrow before exploding. "They're learning to hunt what they can't see," Major Thomas F. Farrell said, holding a shard of twisted steel in his palm, the remnant of a bomb that had bored through 6 feet of rock before dying against their wall. He turned the fragment under the light. "And we'll learn to outsmart them." His men had begun to call him the architect of silence. It wasn't meant to flatter. Farrell barely slept anymore, pacing the tunnels with a pencil behind his ear, muttering calculations under his breath. The tunnel had become more than protection. It was an evolving organism, and he its relentless keeper. Harper, ever analytical, watched his commander with growing unease. "You're starting to sound like you think it's alive," he said once, half joking. Farrell's answer was quiet. "It is. It breathes. It endures. It's everything we're trying to be." They now faced a new order from command: create a central storage depot capable of withstanding direct bomb hits from 10,000 feet. The request bordered on madness. Even Harper, normally the optimist, looked pale when he read the directive. "They're asking us to build something indestructible," he said. Farrell only replied, "Then we build something flexible." The new design was nothing like the earlier tunnels. Instead of straight, uniform corridors, Farrell proposed a network of curved chambers and angled shafts, like the interior of a seashell. Blast waves, he theorized, would travel along the curves and dissipate instead of compressing. Harper refined the mathematics, calculating ideal arch radii, vent spacing, and pressure absorption points. "We'll make it breathe the explosion out," he explained to Redden, who scratched his head and muttered, "You mean like lungs?" Harper nodded. "Exactly. A mountain that exhales fire without burning." Construction began under relentless heat. The deeper they dug, the more unstable the soil became. Sections collapsed without warning, and dynamite detonations caused small tremors that echoed for miles. Farrell refused to slow down. "We're racing time," he told his men, "and time's winning." He had grown leaner, his uniform perpetually dusted in gray. Yet his eyes, sharp, unwavering, remained the compass that kept them steady. Every decision carried risk. When Harper suggested installing shock-absorbing joints, steel plates cushioned by rubber layers scavenged from abandoned vehicles, Farrell approved despite supply shortages. Redden and a few others scavenged tires from wrecked jeeps, cutting and layering them by lantern light. The men worked through nights filled with distant thunder, never knowing if it was weather or war. "If these joints hold," Harper said, "they'll redirect energy away from the living quarters." Farrell smirked faintly. "And if they don't?" Harper didn't answer. One afternoon, a supply aircraft dropped crates labeled, "Test Ordnance, Handle with Care." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Command wanted to test their new design, by bombing it. Farrell gathered his crew around a crude map pinned to the wall. "They'll drop 3 direct hits," he said evenly. "If we did our job right, we'll be alive to sweep afterward. If not, well, we won't have to." Nervous laughter rippled through the ranks. The test day dawned cloudless and cruelly bright. The men retreated inside the tunnel, sealing the outer blast doors. Harper stood near the instrumentation table, a seismograph needle trembling faintly in anticipation. Farrell watched the doorway, jaw tight, hand resting against the wall as if listening for the first heartbeat of a storm. Then it came, a rising whine followed by impact. The mountain convulsed. Dust fell in soft waves. Another explosion, closer, sharper, then a third that shook the floor like a giant stomp. Silence followed, a silence so deep it made their ears ring. The men waited. When Farrell finally unlatched the door and stepped out, the air outside shimmered with heat and smoke. The hillside was scarred, cratered, and blackened, but the entrance still stood. Inside, the structure was intact. No collapse. No cracks. Harper stared at the gauges and exhaled. "Pressure within tolerance," he said softly. It worked. Farrell looked around at the soot-covered men and gave the smallest nod. "We built lungs," he murmured. The success reached command within hours. The design was approved for replication across the Pacific and even in mainland U.S. installations. Yet the victory carried an undercurrent of dread. The stronger the bombs became, the deeper they were forced to go. "We're chasing safety into the ground," Harper said one night, staring at the blueprints. "And if we keep digging, one day we won't find our way back up." Farrell didn't answer at first. He traced a finger over the curves of the diagram and said, "Then we make sure what we leave behind is worth finding." As weeks passed, the tests grew more extreme. Engineers introduced simulated blasts with stacked TNT charges, then with real ordnance captured from the enemy. Farrell personally oversaw each detonation. Once, a shockwave knocked him off his feet, and when he rose, his ears were bleeding. "Still standing," he said hoarsely, and limped away before anyone could stop him. Redden watched his commander with a mix of awe and fear. "He's turning into one of his tunnels," he whispered to Harper. "Hard on the outside, hollowing inside." Harper didn't disagree. Then came the order that changed everything. A new weapon was being developed on the mainland, one whose power was beyond comprehension. The command wanted test chambers built to contain experimental materials. Farrell was told little, only that the work must be secret and secure. "This isn't just defense anymore," he told Harper privately. "They're building towards something terrible." Harper, exhausted and coughing from dust inhalation, replied, "We don't ask what's inside the crates. We just build the walls." The arrival of new personnel, scientists in civilian clothes, guarded convoys, equipment sealed in lead boxes, deepened the mystery. The engineers were forbidden from certain chambers once construction finished. Still, curiosity gnawed at Farrell. He began to suspect these tunnels were not merely for shelter but for creation. Labs buried under tons of rock, hidden from both enemy and conscience. Late one night, after most of the crew had turned in, Farrell found Harper alone, staring at a glowing chemical barrel under guard. "You think these tunnels will save us?" Farrell asked quietly. Harper shook his head. "No. But they'll give us time to regret what we've done." A few weeks later, during another seismic test, a delayed detonation triggered prematurely. The explosion tore through an auxiliary shaft, sealing 3 men inside. Redden was among them. Farrell led the rescue, refusing to wait for reinforcements. The air reeked of smoke and burning insulation. Hours passed as they dug through debris. When they finally reached the chamber, they found Redden alive but barely breathing. His first words were weak but defiant. "Told you the mountain breathes." Farrell squeezed his shoulder and whispered, "So do you, son." That night, as the survivors rested under flickering lamps, Harper walked up to Farrell and said, "We've built something that even bombs respect." Farrell stared at the darkened passageway ahead. "Maybe," he said. "But respect isn't peace." He knew that no matter how deep they built, the war above would find new ways to reach them. Still, when dawn came, he picked up his pencil again. There were new calculations to make, new reinforcements to design, and the echoing promise of survival whispering through stone. Outside, the Pacific horizon glowed red from distant fires. Inside, the tunnel breathed steadily, like the chest of a sleeping giant. Farrell looked toward the entrance, hearing the faint thunder of far-off detonations, and said to himself, "We've learned to survive the sky. Now we have to survive what waits beneath it." And as the first light touched the concrete walls, the engineers returned to work, unaware that history was about to descend even deeper into the earth they had tamed. The war ended quietly for the men who had lived beneath it. There were no parades for tunnel builders, no medals for endurance. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Major Thomas F. Farrell received the news underground, where he'd spent the last 3 years turning the earth into armor. Around him, the tunnels hummed with the low murmur of generators, the faint metallic ring of tools being packed away for the last time. Harper sat nearby, hunched over a battered notebook, tracing equations that no longer mattered. "So that's it," he said softly. "All this and the world moves on." Farrell looked up from his maps. "The world moves on because of this." The engineers had been ordered to seal most of the installations, destroy records, and prepare for redeployment. But the tunnels, they couldn't be destroyed. Too deep. Too strong. Farrell walked their lengths one final time, the walls sweating in the tropical heat. Every step echoed like a heartbeat, steady and haunting. He ran his hand over the concrete, remembering the men who'd poured it, the ones who'd never walked back out. It wasn't just stone, it was memory hardened into form. "We built eternity," he whispered. Harper overheard and smiled faintly. "Eternity leaks," he said, pointing at a droplet running down the wall. Farrell laughed for the first time in weeks. Outside, the island was changing. Troops were shipping out, and silence was replacing the drone of machinery. Yet something in Farrell resisted leaving. He had built so much that would now be left unseen, and that invisibility felt like betrayal. One afternoon, as he packed away blueprints, a messenger brought sealed orders, classified. Farrell broke the wax, read the letter once, then twice. He was to travel to the mainland to a site called Los Alamos, New Mexico. The government needed his expertise for a project involving containment, precision, and safety. Harper was to accompany him. They exchanged glances but said nothing. They both understood. The tunnels had taught the army how to hide power, and now that power had evolved into something unspeakable. When they arrived in the desert, the difference was surreal. The air was dry, the sky impossibly wide. But beneath that stillness, Farrell recognized the same rhythm of secrecy, the same hum of machines, the same clipped tone in officers' voices. Only now the threat was not enemy bombs. It was what humanity was about to unleash upon itself. Inside the lab's construction zone, he saw familiar blueprints: arched ceilings, pressure vents, reinforced steel ribs. His tunnels reborn. "They're using our designs," Harper murmured. Farrell said nothing. He didn't need to. Weeks later, as the desert wind howled over the white sands, Farrell stood before a half-buried testing structure, his heart heavy with the weight of recognition. The blast-proof vault, the shock-resistant doors, it was all his work, perfected. He realized too late what it was meant to contain. "We taught them how to protect life," he said quietly, "and they used it to shield death." Harper turned to him, his eyes hollow. "Every wall we built kept something in. We never asked what." Farrell didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The first test was scheduled for July 16, 1945. They called it Trinity. Farrell stood miles away, a dark figure against the pale horizon. When the explosion came, it was as if the sun had been reborn in silence, then roared like the sky itself had split open. The light seared the desert white, and for a moment even the wind forgot to move. Farrell shielded his eyes. Harper, standing beside him, whispered, "The tunnel won't save anyone from this." When the shockwave reached them, it was like the heartbeat of the world stopping and starting again. In the weeks that followed, Farrell barely spoke. He worked on decommissioning Pacific structures, signing papers he didn't read. His hands trembled when he held a pen. The war was over, yet something deeper had begun. A war with conscience, invisible and endless. Harper left the service soon after, returning to civilian life, though life no longer seemed an accurate word for what men like him were living. Farrell stayed behind, overseeing the last sealing operations in the Pacific. "You're still listening to the mountain," Harper told him in his farewell letter. "But now maybe the mountain's listening back." Farrell returned to Espiritu Santo one final time in 1946. The jungle had reclaimed much of the base. Vines crept over bunkers and parrots nested in rusted helmets. The air smelled of salt and earth as it always had. He found the tunnel entrance half hidden by moss. Inside it was cool and dry, the walls still smooth, the air still clean. He lit a lantern and walked slowly, boots echoing. Each turn brought back a memory: Redden's laughter, Harper's quiet intensity, the endless calculations scribbled in dust. Near the central chamber he stopped. The inscription he'd carved on the wall years ago was still there: "We built to outlast fear." He sat down on a crate and listened to the silence. The world outside had moved to new wars, new weapons, but in here time had paused. The tunnel felt alive again, breathing faintly, whispering its old promise of protection. Farrell reached into his pocket and pulled out the tin box he had kept through the years. Inside were his letters, yellowed and soft. He unfolded one and read aloud, "We live in darkness, but we build for light." His voice trembled. "God help us," he added quietly. "We built both." As night fell, thunder rolled across the horizon. Not bombs this time, just weather, but it sounded the same. Farrell rose and walked to the entrance. Rain began to fall, steady and familiar. He tilted his head back, letting it wash over his face. For a moment, he imagined the men still working behind him, the hum of drills, the clang of hammers, the murmur of voices arguing over equations. He could almost hear Harper saying, "It flexes, Tom, it bends, remember?" He smiled faintly. It flexes, he repeated. And so must we. In the distance, lightning flashed, bright and fleeting like the memory of the bomb. Farrell turned off his lantern and stood in the dark, letting the mountain's quiet weight settle around him. For the first time he wasn't afraid of it. He understood now that the tunnels weren't built just to survive destruction. They were monuments to human defiance, to the fragile hope that knowledge could be used for mercy as well as war. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Let what we built outlast our mistakes." The next morning, villagers found the entrance sealed from within. No one knew who had done it or when. They said the air still felt warm as if someone had just left. Decades later, when scientists rediscovered the site, they were astonished. The structure remained stable. No cracks, no flooding, no decay. Instruments showed it could withstand an 8.0 magnitude earthquake even after 80 years. One of them, brushing dust off the old inscription, read the words aloud and smiled. "We built to outlast fear," he said softly. Outside, the jungle rustled with life. Inside, the tunnel stood silent, unbroken, patient. Somewhere, perhaps only in the imagination, the faint sound of an engineer's boots echoed once more, steady, deliberate, eternal. The mountain, it seemed, still remembered its maker. And far away, in deserts and cities built on his unseen foundations, the world went on living inside the strength he left behind.